General Hospital spoilers for Monday, January 19th reveal that Willow's freedom did not arrive quietly. It came like a storm breaking open a sky that had been held in place for far too long. After months of fear, accusations, and a truth so distorted it nearly swallowed her whole, Willow finally stood on the other side of the chaos with her name cleared, and her life no longer defined by shadows. But freedom, she quickly realized, was not an ending. It was the beginning of a new and far more complicated shift or recalibration of control, identity, and power that demanded she step into a version of herself she had never fully allowed to exist. The moment the charges evaporated and the world stopped calling her a criminal, Willow felt something inside her unlock. For the first time, she could breathe without flinching, speak without apologizing, and think about Wiley and Amelia without that crushing fear that someone else might dictate their future. This shift, subtle at first, grew into something fierce, a resolve that she would no longer be a passive participant in her own life, nor a woman shaped solely by guilt or expectation. Her instinct as a mother sharpened immediately. If before she held back, terrified of making the wrong move, now Willow began asserting herself with clarity bordering on defiance. She started to rebuild her relationship with Wiley on her own terms, no longer allowing Michael or anyone else to frame her as unstable or unfit. She noticed the way Wiley looked at her differently now, not with confusion, but curiosity, like he was rediscovering a mother he had once known, but forgotten under the weight of lies. And with Amelia, the bond was even more fragile and precious, something Willow held like a vow. Her freedom meant she could fight openly for her daughters, shaping their futures without fear of being silenced or erased. But the adjustment did not end with her children. Drew's role in her story once a blurred, painful complication began transforming into something far more explosive. Their shared secrets, their shared survival, and the tangled consequences of everything that had unfolded began knitting them together in unexpected ways. Drew, once convinced that control was the only way to keep chaos at bay, now found himself destabilized by Willow's emergence as a force he could no longer predict or contain. And Willow, newly awakened to her own strength, realized she was no longer willing to let Drew dictate the narrative surrounding the past, the shooting, or the future of their intertwined lives. This created a new tension between them, intense, electrified, and volatile. Willow no longer felt the need to protect Drew from the truth, or shield him from the consequences of his own manipulations. Instead, she began to recognize her own leverage. For the first time, she could see Drew not as a man who controlled her fate, but as a man whose fate might depend on her choices. The shift was subtle but seismic. As Willow expanded her influence over Wiley and Amelia, she simultaneously began reclaiming her power in ways that unsettled Drew deeply. The legal system's declaration of her innocence became a catalyst for everything else to unravel and rebuild. She started questioning alliances she once accepted blindly, examining every decision, every relationship, every moment that had pushed her to the edge. And with each question, she uncovered more of Drew's involvement, more of his hidden agendas, and more of the control he once wielded with quiet precision. What had begun as thankfulness toward him turned into suspicion, and suspicion hardened into a sharp awareness. Her freedom threatened Drew's stability. This realization marked the beginning of a new battle, one not fought in courtrooms, but in the spaces between them, in the shifting power dynamics of their shattered trust. Drew, sensing this, tried to adjust. He softened his approach, attempted to rewrite his involvement, to present himself as a protector rather than a participant in the storm that nearly destroyed her. But Willow saw through the cracks. His attempts to hold on only highlighted the changes within her, revealing just how much control she now possessed. And beneath all of this, something else simmered: Willow's newfound determination to redefine her place in the world. She was no longer the woman who bowed her head, apologized for existing, or absorbed the consequences of other people's sins. Her freedom had sculpted her into someone sharper, stronger, more precise, a woman with the power to reshape the lives of those around her, especially Wiley and Amelia. She wasn't afraid of confrontation anymore. She wasn't afraid of Michael's judgment, Nina's involvement, or Drew's unraveling. She understood now that her voice carried enough force to shift the entire landscape. and she intended to use it. What came next would not be peaceful. Willow's rise meant a new era of conflict, custody battles, emotional reckonings, legal recalculations. Her freedom exposed every imbalance, every lie, every dangerous thread connecting the lives around her. And Drew, unwilling to be overshadowed, was preparing for his own explosive transformation. Together, they were no longer victims of a collapsing narrative. They were the catalysts driving the next phase of chaos. This was not just a fresh start. It was the beginning of a new war, one that only Willow had the power to win. Jassinda and Michael stood at the edge of a storm they never expected to face. A storm that was gathering faster and more violently than either of them could control. What began as a quiet, uncertain connection between them had spiraled into a crisis defined by suspicion, fear, and consequences they could not escape. Each day brought a new shift, a new adjustment that only pushed them deeper into a world where loyalty became a liability, and every choice felt like a ticking bomb. And now, with the investigation taking a dramatic turn, Michael suddenly found himself positioned as the #1 suspect. In the shooting of Drew, a twist that shattered whatever fragile balance remained in his life, and thrust both him and Jassinda into the center of a rapidly collapsing narrative. The moment the authorities identified inconsistencies in Michael's timeline, the world around him began to distort. Those who once defended him began to hesitate. Those who doubted him found new reasons to look twice. And Jassinda, entangled emotionally and potentially physically if she truly carried his child, became part of the unfolding chaos. Her presence beside him was no longer simple companionship, it became a spotlight, intensifying every rumor, every whisper, every accusation. What had been a private bond was now dissected through a public lens, turning their relationship into evidence rather than affection. For Michael, the shift was brutal. He had spent months fighting to control the narrative surrounding Wiley and Amelia, trying to position himself as the stable parent, the moral anchor. But the moment suspicion tightened around him, everything he had fought for began slipping out of his grasp. The possibility that he might have been involved in bribing Judge Heron, combined with the resurfacing of long-buried tensions with Drew, painted a damning picture, one that prosecutors and reporters were eager to exploit. Every conflict between him and Drew, every moment of resentment, suddenly became ammunition. The world began constructing a motive out of fragments Michael couldn't deny, because they were real, emotional, and raw. Jassinda, meanwhile, was living her own version of the nightmare. The whispers about her pregnancy, a rumor that might turn to truth, became a weapon wielded by those who wanted to further implicate Michael. The idea of a new baby, conceived in the middle of this explosion, created panic she couldn't suppress. Her life, once private and contained, was now being pulled apart piece by piece to determine whether she could be used to corner Michael. Further, every decision she made carried consequences she never imagined, and the fear of losing everything became a shadow she couldn't escape. But Jassinda was no fragile bystander. As the investigation grew more chaotic, she began studying the shifts with a quiet, calculated precision. She saw how the walls were closing in on Michael, how enemies old and new were tightening their grip, and she recognized that if she did nothing, the man who had become the center of her world would collapse beneath the weight of accusations that might destroy not only his future, but hers as well. This realization sparked a new kind of fire inside her, one born from instinct, desperation, and a fierce need for survival. At the same time, Michael's world continued to fracture. Nina's increasing involvement, Willow's rising strength, Drew's carefully rebuilt reputation all positioned him as the perfect scapegoat. The authorities wanted closure, the public wanted a villain, and Michael was standing right in the middle, vulnerable, exposed, and unable to escape the momentum working against him. The more he tried to explain, the deeper he sank into the narrative being built around him. Even his attempts to protect Wiley and Amelia became twisted into motives for violence, painting him as a man willing to do anything, even something unforgivable, to preserve control. This was the heart of the new adjustment, a descent into a reality where Michael no longer shaped events, but was shaped by them. He felt the strain tightening around him, the sense that his identity as a father, a partner, and a man was slipping beneath forces he couldn't fight alone. And yet, Jassinda refused to let him drown. Her growing involvement, however controversial, became the lifeline he didn't realize he needed. But her presence also invited danger. Every alliance she formed, every secret she uncovered, and every risk she took brought them both deeper into the madness. And the madness was growing. Rumors began circulating that evidence had been found, linking Michael to the weapon used against Drew. Witnesses emerged claiming they saw Michael near the scene. Financial records hinted at transactions that could be interpreted as bribes. Nothing had been proven, but the narrative was too compelling for investigators to ignore. Port Charles began buzzing with theories, each one more dangerous than the last. To the outside world, Michael was no longer the grieving friend, he was a man cornered by his own lies. And within that chaos, Jassinda saw the truth clearly. If they didn't act soon, Michael would lose everything. This understanding pushed her into a role she never expected to take on: strategist, protector, and co-conspirator. She began mapping out every person who stood against them, every weakness in the case, every opening they might exploit before the story consumed them both. Her dedication wasn't simply emotional, it was tactical. The fear of losing Michael and the potential child she might be carrying sharpened her instincts into something formidable. Together, they moved into a new phase, one defined by secrecy, calculated steps, and the awareness that every misstep could trigger a catastrophe. The adjustments they made were not gentle shifts, but explosive recalibrations that altered the trajectory of their lives. And as pressure mounted, one truth became clear: the real story was no longer about who shot Drew. It was about who would survive the fallout. What began as whispers had become a wildfire, and in the center of it, Jassinda and Michael stood together, two people bound by fear, love, and a crisis spiraling far beyond their control, bracing themselves for the next wave of destruction that was already rushing toward them. Alexis felt the shock hit her so violently that for a moment she forgot how to breathe. Willow's acquittal, those simple words delivered with unshakable finality, should have offered relief, stability, an end to the relentless anxiety that had gripped Port Charles for months. Instead, it cracked open a reality far more unstable than the one that existed before. Alexis had braced herself for many outcomes, but not this one. Not the ripple effect that immediately began spreading the moment the judge declared Willow innocent. The courtroom itself seemed to tilt, and Alexis felt as if every certainty she had held was being pulled out from under her feet. Something monumental had shifted, and she could feel the consequences rushing toward her before anyone else even understood what was happening. The real blow came seconds later, when Diane stepped forward with that practiced, lethal calm that only she possessed. Diane's voice did not tremble, did not rise, did not falter. Instead, she delivered her revelation with razor precision, a bomb disguised as a legal update. A twist positioned so strategically that no one had time to shield themselves. As Diane spoke, Alexis felt the dread coil inside her like a living thing. She had underestimated Diane. She had prepared for counter-arguments, for motions and objections, for legal maneuvers. What she had not prepared for was a shock so severe it would unravel the entire structure of the case. Diane did not simply announce a fact. She detonated a truth designed to reshape everything. And it did. The moment the implications settled in, Alexis felt her pulse quicken. The acquittal wasn't the end of the trial, it was the beginning of a new nightmare. Willow's innocence meant the prosecution needed a new path, a new target, a new suspect. And in that shifting vacuum of blame and speculation, Alexis saw one horrifying truth rise to the surface. Diane's revelation had created an opening that placed Michael in an unprecedented position of advantage. The innocence of Willow did not simply free her, it empowered Michael, sharpened his legal leverage, and altered the balance of custody, public sympathy, and strategic control. The panic struck even deeper as Alexis recognized exactly what Diane had done. This wasn't just smart lawyering, it was warfare. Diane had moved the pieces of the board so subtly, so flawlessly, that Alexis hadn't noticed the trap until she was already standing in it. Everything about Willow's acquittal now pointed toward a scenario Alexis had feared from the beginning: that the narrative would shift violently, that the pressure would redirect, and that those who had tried to maintain control, herself included, would lose their footing instantly. The courtroom murmured with confusion, but Alexis heard only the roaring inside her chest. Diane's announcement had exposed something larger, darker, more dangerous. This case was no longer about guilt or innocence. It had evolved into an obsession, a psychological battle, a shifting of alliances and motives that even the legal system couldn't contain. And at the center of that chaotic shift stood Michael. Michael, who only hours earlier had been grappling with accusations and the loss of moral authority, now found himself in possession of a new narrative. He was not the man under scrutiny anymore. He was the father of children tied to a woman who had just been declared innocent, the man aligned with public sympathy, the one whose decisions suddenly carried the weight of legitimacy. Alexis could already see how the media would spin this. She could see how family courts, custody judges, and public opinion would react. Willow's acquittal cleared a path for Michael to claim something far more powerful than victory. It allowed him to reclaim the narrative he had been losing for months. But that was only the surface. Beneath it lay something even more terrifying, the possibility that Diane's maneuver had deliberately pushed suspicion toward Michael in ways no one could defend against. Diane had not exposed a villain, she had exposed a void the investigation would now rush to fill, a void that would drag Michael into its orbit whether he wanted it or not. And that realization, sharp, relentless, sent Alexis into deeper panic, because she understood better than anyone what happened when innocence was declared too neatly. The case did not die. It shifted targets. Her mind raced as she replayed every detail, the shooting, the testimonies, the inconsistencies, the secrets whispered behind closed doors, the alliances forming and dissolving around them. She could see now that the prosecution would not walk away empty-handed. They needed someone to blame. And Michael, by virtue of standing closest to Willow, by virtue of being deeply entangled in every aspect of the case, had become the most convenient target. But this wasn't only about the law. It was about the psychological unraveling that accompanied it. Alexis had been in courtrooms her entire life. She knew the signs. She recognized the pattern. Panic did not come from uncertainty, it came from seeing the future too clearly. And she saw it now, the turning of public perception, the whispers about motive, the scrutiny of Michael's relationship with Drew, the questions about custody, the suspicion that would grow like a stain no matter how many facts were presented. Willow being declared innocent meant someone else had to be guilty. Someone else had to bear the weight of the crime. And with Diane's announcement stretching across every corner of the courtroom, Alexis saw that Michael had just been placed at the center of that spotlight. The pressure would crush him. But what terrified her most was that he didn't seem to realize it yet. Michael's initial relief at Willow's freedom blinded him to the shift Diane had orchestrated. He felt victory when he should have felt dread. He saw hope when he should have seen danger. And Alexis, standing there helpless, knew she would be the one forced to confront the fallout long before Michael even understood how drastically his circumstances had changed. The obsession Diane ignited was not Willow's. It was the system's, and it was already turning toward Michael. Alexis swallowed hard, trying to steady herself as the courtroom emptied. The space felt distorted, like a place where truths had twisted into something unrecognizable. She wanted to tell herself that she was overreacting, that Diane's revelation was just another tactic, that nothing had truly changed. But she knew better. She knew that Diane didn't move without purpose, didn't speak without calculation, didn't reveal information unless she had already predicted every possible outcome. And the outcome here was clear. Willow was free. Michael was exposed. The system needed a villain. And Alexis could feel her panic rising again, because the consequences wouldn't stop at Michael. They would ripple outward to Willow, to Wiley, to Amelia, to the entire Corinthos family until nothing familiar remained. This was not a victory. This was the first tremor of a much larger quake. And Alexis knew, with chilling certainty, that Diane had just changed everything. Ross was no longer content to linger in the shadows of Brennan's operation. Something inside him had snapped into motion, pushing him into a far more aggressive role than anyone expected. What began as quiet suspicion had grown into an active pursuit of the truth, driven by the unbearable pressure of knowing that Sidwell had been hiding far more than simple bureaucratic secrets. Every new detail Ross uncovered seemed to widen the cracks in the narrative Brennan had spent years constructing, and those cracks were beginning to spread faster than Brennan could contain them. Ross felt it in his bones. The balance of power was tilting, and he was the one pushing it. The adjustments Ross made were subtle at first, questions asked at the wrong moments, files skimmed after hours, conversations replayed in his mind until the pattern finally revealed itself. But once he understood the extent of what Sidwell was concealing, the shift inside him became irreversible. Sidwell wasn't just protecting sensitive information. He was manipulating the entire structure of the agency, rerouting operations, burying assets, and controlling agents with psychological precision. And Brennan, whether willingly or blindly, was enabling it. This realization became an obsession for Ross. The truth was no longer something he wanted, it was something he needed. Something that consumed him every waking hour. As Ross pushed deeper, the pressure on Brennan intensified. Suddenly, Ross's questions were sharper, his reports more pointed, his observations impossible for Brennan to ignore. Brennan felt the shift immediately. Ross wasn't just gathering intel, he was challenging authority. And that challenge struck directly at Brennan's weakest point, his fear that his entire leadership was built on illusions orchestrated by Sidwell. Ross's new behavior forced Brennan to confront suspicions he had tried to suppress. Each report Ross delivered, each contradiction he exposed, tightened the noose around Brennan's confidence. What frightened Brennan most was not Ross's accusations, but the clarity behind them. Ross had stopped doubting himself. He had stopped hesitating. Something in his demeanor, sharp, unyielding, made it clear that he knew he was right. Brennan began to feel cornered, as though every decision he made was being measured against a truth Ross already possessed. The pressure became unbearable, and with that pressure came paranoia. Brennan sensed eyes on him everywhere, in hallways, in briefings, in the quiet moments before sleep. Ross had become the embodiment of everything Brennan feared: exposure, failure, and the collapse of the delicate structure Sidwell had built around him. The more Brennan tried to tighten control, the more Ross pushed back. Their exchanges grew tenser, their meetings shorter, their silences louder. Ross had found his weapon, truth, and Brennan had no defense against it. Every lie he offered only fueled Ross's determination. Every attempt to dismiss Ross's findings only made him dig deeper. And the deeper he dug, the more dangerous the game became. Sidwell, watching from a distance, sensed the shift as well. Ross had become a threat not because he was loud, but because he was methodical. He was peeling back layers Sidwell had spent years constructing, and that made him unpredictable. Sidwell knew that a man driven by obsession could not be bought, bribed, or intimidated. Ross was stepping into territory where agents vanished, where truths never surfaced, where secrets were protected with blood. Sidwell understood what Brennan had not. Ross was no longer operating within the boundaries of the agency. He was following his own internal compass, and that made him uncontrollable. The tension escalated quickly. Brennan's once stable authority eroded with each passing day, his decisions questioned, his alliances weakening. Ross's pursuit had become a mirror reflecting all of Brennan's failures and all of Sidwell's manipulations. The obsession that consumed Ross now extended to Brennan, as well, an obsession to silence him, to regain control, to stop the unraveling narrative before it destroyed them all. But it was already too late. Ross had tasted the truth. He had seen the rot beneath the polished surface of the agency. And Ross, once loyal and restrained, had transformed into something far more dangerous, a man who understood the cost of silence and refused to pay it. What lay ahead was inevitable. The pressure would rise, the secrets would surface, and Brennan would find himself trapped in a battle he could no longer command. Ross's actions had set a new sequence into motion, one that could not be undone, one that promised fallout far beyond anything Brennan or Sidwell anticipated. The adjustments had already begun. The obsession had already taken root, and the storm Ross unleashed was only just beginning.